It pleases you, Mr. Speaker.
Continue on.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, the path to realizing a properly regulated gaming industry for Bermuda has been a challenging one. Since the Green Paper on Gaming for Bermuda, too little discernible progress has been made to actually introduce gaming on a scale that supports tourism and adds to the product offerings for travelers to Bermuda. However, Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to advise the Honorable House of a further step in the process today. As is reflected on the order paper, I will introduce into the legislature the Gaming Transfer of Functions Bill 2021, the Betting Bill 2021, and the Betting Fees Regulations 2021. Mr. Speaker, honorable members will recall the intent for the Bermuda Casino Gaming Commission to assume the responsibility for all forms of gaming in Bermuda, namely casino gaming, betting, cruise ships, casinos, lotteries, and raffles, and finally, Crown and Anchor. This will also occasion a change in the name of the commission, which will thereafter be known as Bermuda Gaming Commission. The primary purpose of these proposals was to facilitate greater efficiency and certainty in how gaming is regulated in Bermuda. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, honorable members will recall the initiative for the modernization of the regulatory framework for Bermuda's betting sector. The bills we table today accomplish those objectives and mark a significant step in providing the necessary framework for the regulation of gaming in Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, the Gaming Transfer of Functions Bill is largely one of consequential amendments, meaning that it proposes to change a raft of statutes primarily for the purpose of expanding the regulatory remit for the Commission. As stated, the Commission will be responsible for the regulation of casino gaming, betting, cruise ship casinos, lotteries and raffles, and Crown and Anchor. The Commission will also be permitted to collect all associated fees, levies, and taxes resulting from these additional economic sectors, save for the betting duty. Both the amount of the duty and the procedures for the submission and collection of duty by the tax commissioner will remain as they currently are. The Betting Bill 2021 provides for a completely separate regulatory regime for the betting sector. The regulatory framework of the betting sector in Bermuda has not been refreshed since the enactment of the Betting Act 1975 and is now somewhat outdated. National and global circumstances and considerations have significantly changed since that time. Concepts such as due diligence and anti-money laundering standards were not fully developed in 1975. Given that Bermuda is a leading global financial center, we must ensure that the regulation of our industries are commensurate with international best practices and standards and appropriate for our industry. The Betting Bill 2021 will repeal and replace the Betting Act 1975. Mr. Speaker, the improvements to the betting regime are beneficial for Bermuda as they demonstrate our commitment to a modernized approach to regulation. The proposed statutory provisions contain key elements of a modern regulatory framework. Mr. Speaker, extensive work was performed on the development of the appropriate underlying policy. There was wide-ranging consultation with local stakeholders, including current licensees, the betting operators, the Betting License Authority, the National Anti-Money Laundering Committee, the Financial Intelligence Agency, and the Director of Public Prosecutions. Mr. Speaker, we wish to extend our sincere thanks for the continued engagement of our stakeholders with the Commission in regard to betting sector-relating activities. Mr. Speaker, there was also consultation with international regulatory agencies, international consultants, and jurisdictional comparisons of statutory betting frameworks were conducted and considered. In particular, the provisions of the Bahamas, Jamaica, Cyprus, jurisdictions thought to have similarities to Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the bills being tabled today, I'm pleased to provide an update on the developments of the casino gaming sector and the work of the Commission. Mr. Speaker, I can confirm to honorable members that the post of Chief Executive of the Commission was filled in late 2020 by Mr. Jean Major, who comes to the Commission with a wealth of experience as a regulator and has added a valued dimension of expertise to the operations of the Commission. Mr. Speaker, earlier this year, Hotelco Bermuda Holding Limited, known locally as St. Regis, entered the final stages of making an operational casino in Bermuda a reality. They are the holder of a provisional casino license and have submitted a formal application for a casino license. The statutorily required suitability review of the applicants is well underway by the Commission. Mr. Speaker, the suitability review entails extensive due diligence in respect of every substantive effort of the applicant's honesty and integrity, associates, ownership interests, governance, operational and financial controls. This is to ensure that only good characters are permitted to enter the Bermuda market and to establish a healthy compliance culture. The results of the review will be submitted to the Board of the Commission for a final decision on the issuance of a casino license in due course. Mr. Speaker, in furtherance of establishing an operational casino in Bermuda, the Commission have initiated a number of necessary processes, the first being an approval process for gaming vendors who supply goods and service to the casino operator, such as game machines and other gaming equipment. As of today, 3 gaming vendors have been approved by the Commission. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, the Commission have recently concluded a consultation process for the approval of gaming equipment, technical specification, and standards of performance. These standards are compliant with Bermuda's statutory framework and reflect current international standards. The standards are expected to be formally approved and made publicly available by the Commission before the end of this month. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the Problem Gaming Council, in close collaboration with the Commission team, will continue to ensure that social responsibility remains a key pillar of casino gaming in Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, in the midst of all that we as a government and a community have to deal with owing to this pandemic, the introduction of these bills today and the update on the considerable work of the Commission demonstrate this government's commitment to continuing the work of opening and diversifying both our economy and tourism. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. The next statement this morning is in the name of the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs and Constitutional Reform. AG, would you like to present your statement at this stage?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Good morning and thank you.
Good morning and continue.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to table in this honorable House the bill entitled the Criminal Code Amendment Non-Consensual Sharing of Intimate Images Act 2021. This bill introduces criminal offenses and penalties relating to the non-consensual sharing or threat of sharing intimate images and prohibited visual recordings, as well as the offenses of observing or making recordings in breach of a person's privacy. Mr. Speaker, in our 21st century world, a new form of technology facilitated abuse has emerged that is commonly known as revenge porn. Revenge porn typically occurs when someone shares or makes threats to share intimate images of a person without the person's consent. Increasingly, intimate images are being recorded and stored on our smartphones. This means that in an instant, an intimate image can be uploaded to a social media platform, forwarded or broadcast at the swipe of a finger with little concern about the long-standing consequences or harm to the person captured in the image. In no time at all, an intimate image uploaded to the internet can trend or become viral in an instant and is exceedingly difficult to remove permanently from the internet. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, weaponizing intimate images created under the trusting sanctity of a romantic relationship can be used as a tool to inflict revenge when the relationship breaks down. Even though the intimate images may have been obtained in a consensual context, the parties are unlikely to have consented for the intimate images to be shared with third parties outside the relationship. Oftentimes, the associated threats may be to distribute the intimate images to a specific person or persons to cause the maximum harm to the recorded person. Intimate images can also be distributed without any forewarning threats. Mr. Speaker, in today's digital world, non-consensual distribution of intimate images can take the simple form of images sent to friends and family of the recorded person. The end result being to expose, humiliate, embarrass, or cause reputational damage to the recorded person. Undoubtedly, the stress and trauma imposed on the victims to such acts and their families can be far-reaching. In the gravest cases, affected persons have contemplated, attempted, or committed suicide because of the associated distress and embarrassment. In some circumstances, the threat to distribute intimate images is intended to cause alarm to other affected individuals, not only harm to the person recorded in the intimate image. Whatever the likely or intended harm, once intimate images have been shared digitally without consent, it is difficult or impossible to contain them from spreading like wildfire. Mr. Speaker, although minimal protections exist addressing the distribution of obscene or indecent images under the provisions of the Telecommunications Act 1986, There is a glaring gap in the existing law because the prevailing offenses do not sufficiently address intimate images and prohibited visual recordings within the context of revenge porn. There are also no criminal provisions in the existing law that deal specifically with the threat to distribute such images. We have surveyed other jurisdictions, including Canada, the UK, and Australia, that have each introduced specific criminal offenses prohibiting the non-consensual distribution or threatened distribution of intimate images. Canada's and Queensland, Australia's approach to such offenses were considered in detail in formulating the policy. Accordingly, Queensland's approach is primarily modeled in the bill being tabled today, as the criminal code amendments were considered most appropriate for Bermuda. Queensland's criminal law prohibits the distribution without consent of an intimate image of another person in a manner that will cause distress reasonably arising in all of the circumstances. The legislative wording is adopted in this bill. Mr. Speaker, you've heard me use the terms intimate image and prohibited visual recording. These two terms are germane to the legislative interpretation of the proposed amendments to the Criminal Code Act 1907 and are defined in the bill. The term intimate image includes intimate images that have been digitally altered. Digital alteration can be done to an image to depict intimate sexual activity or private body parts, and digital alteration can also apply when intimate sexual activity or private body parts are obscured if the person in the image is still depicted in a sexual way. The term prohibited visual recording is also defined in the bill to deal with circumstances where recording is made in circumstances where a reasonable adult would expect to be afforded privacy. Mr. Speaker, the relevant offenses proposed within the bill for inclusion in the Criminal Code Act 1907 are observations or recordings in breach of privacy, distributing intimate images, distributing prohibited visual recordings, and threats to distribute intimate images or prohibited visual recordings. Mr. Speaker, to operate as an appropriate deterrent and to ensure the seriousness of the offenses is understood by the public, the penalties for all offenses are up to 3 years on summary conviction and up to 5 years on indictment. Mr. Speaker, the victims of the crimes being created are likely to want to have a remedy in law that can help stop the distribution of the offending images and have them deleted altogether. In this regard, provisions are made in the bill to allow the court to make a rectification order ordering the removal, retraction, recovery, deletion, or destruction of any offending images after a successful prosecution. In closing, Mr. Speaker, this bill deals only with the criminal aspects of this issue. It achieves this by creating relevant offenses and proportionate penalties, ensuring that offenders can be successfully prosecuted and dissuading offending behavior. It is important to note that the criminal law alone is sometimes a harsh instrument to address contemporary social issues. Deterring the offending behavior and effective punishment must also be augmented with a more holistic societal approach encompassing civil law remedies, public awareness campaigns, education, and other community-wide efforts to raise awareness about the associated dangers of recording intimate images. Individually and collectively, we have a responsibility to be vigilant and discerning about our conduct in digital and online spaces. The assistance of the wider community is paramount to protecting our youth, especially as they navigate their maturation in a digital social media age. It is anticipated, Mr. Speaker, that this new law will directly protect victims of revenge porn and others whose privacy will be violated by misuse of intimate images and private recordings. It will indirectly protect societal values by upholding privacy and personal protections from the irreparable harm that such violations inevitably impose on others. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Deputy CPC, Lorraine Welch, the Director of Public Prosecutions, and Lawyer and Policy Analyst, Jason Otteridge, for their excellent work on this very important initiative. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. The next statement this morning is in the name of the Minister of National Security. Minister Ming, would you like to make your presentation at this point?
Good morning, Mr. Speaker and listening audience.
Good morning.
Mr. Speaker, I rise this morning to provide this honorable House and the public with a reminder of the legal measures of the Public Health COVID-19 Emergency Powers Regulations 2021, which have been enacted and from time to time amended in an effort to prevent another surge in COVID-19 positive cases in Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, honorable members will be aware that over the course of the last 2 weeks, the Ministry of Health has reported a total of 33 COVID-19 active cases. 5 of these cases were the result of local transmission. Following a period of a consistent decrease in locally transmitted cases, this increase should be concerning to the public. What should also be concerning, Mr. Speaker, are the recent activities that have taken place that are in direct violation of the regulations. Through traditional news media and social media, many of us have seen the evidence of parties and gatherings that exceeded the approved group gathering limits. The fact that the attendees of these events also violated the health and safety protocols by not wearing masks or practicing physical distancing further compounds the recklessness of hosting these events. Mr. Speaker, I understand the community's outrage that these events are taking place, particularly when the majority of our community are rightly adhering to the regulations. I also appreciate the community's frustration at the perception that we are all being punished because of the few who do not adhere to the regulations, and that enough is not being done to hold those accountable who blatantly break the law. Mr. Speaker, I am advised that the Bermuda Police Service and the Department of Public Prosecutions are diligently taking steps to bring those who violate the Public Health Act and the associated regulations before the courts. Mr. Speaker, as we continue to navigate through the pandemic, please allow me to set out some reminders of the parameters of the Public Health COVID-19 Emergency Powers Regulations 2021. First and foremost, we remain under nightly curfew from 12 midnight until 5 a.m. There is also a curfew in effect from 8 p.m. until 5 p.m. for recreational boating. Bars and nightclubs are not permitted to be open beyond 11 p.m. and are limited to table service only. Large group gatherings are still limited to 25 persons. For indoor services or ceremonies in a church or other religious establishment, the number of persons who can gather is limited to 25% of the indoor area's full capacity. At outdoor services or ceremonies, including weddings and funerals, the number of attendees cannot exceed 50 persons. More importantly, Mr. Speaker, appropriate physical distancing and the proper wearing of masks covering both the nose and the mouth is required in all public and private spaces. Mr. Speaker, the regulations provide the Bermuda Police Service with a number of enforcement tools. If a contravention of the Public Health COVID-19 Emergency Powers Regulations has occurred on the premises, the police can order a licensed premise to close for a period not exceeding 24 hours. Mr. Speaker, the public is reminded that as outlined in the regulations, the police or any other enforcement officer may stop and question any individual to ensure compliance with the regulations. If any person is found to be in contravention of the regulations or does not satisfy an enforcement officer's request to comply with the regulations, the enforcement officer may take actions to enforce the regulations, including the dispersal of any group of more than 25 persons. If necessary, an enforcement officer may use reasonable force in the exercise of a power under these regulations. It is an offense to resist, obstruct, or assault an enforcement officer who is acting in the execution of their duty under these regulations. Mr. Speaker, a person who fails to comply with any of these regulations commits an offense and is liable to the following: a fine of $6,000 in respect of a first offense. For a second or subsequent offense, a fine of $10,000 or imprisonment for a term not exceeding 3 months or both. In the case of continuing offense, a fine of $1,000 in respect of each day during which the offense is continued. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, it is an offense to not wear a mask in accordance with the regulations. A person who fails to wear a mask when one is required commits an offense and is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $500 for the first offense, a fine of $1,000 for a second or subsequent offense. Mr. Speaker, these regulations are not meant to be punitive. They have been enacted to minimize the impact of COVID-19 with the hope that we will soon be able to safely gather together again. Notwithstanding, the government has included the noted penalties as a deterrent against violating the regulations. Mr. Speaker, I would like to note that yesterday, the Bermuda Police Service submitted 12 files to the Department of Public Prosecutions. To date, the Department of Public Prosecutions has received 22 files in total for curfew violations and non-compliance to the COVID-19 regulations, and more continue to be submitted regularly. Mr. Speaker, there have been a number of questions regarding the government's fixed penalty legislation. As the Honorable Premier advised at a press conference earlier this week, the Ministry of Health has prepared the framework for legislation that would see fixed penalties apply for a finite set of material breaches of COVID-19 regulations. This legislation is in the drafting stages with the Attorney General's chambers. While it is unlikely that the legislation will be retroactive, the public is again reminded that under the current regulations, people linked to recent parties could be subject to a fine or a conviction. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say that as a country, we have demonstrated resilience and discipline in navigating this pandemic, and we must remain vigilant. Mr. Speaker, we all know that Good Friday and the Easter holiday is upon us. As a result, the ministry team have received a number of large gathering requests. Please note that a careful review will be done before there can be an approval of any event. During the Good Friday, Easter holiday, and any other holiday especially, I am urging residents to exercise a degree of personal responsibility by making smart and sensible decisions to protect themselves and their families, your friends, and your loved ones. Mr. Speaker, we all must continue to do what we can to mitigate and limit the spread of the virus by complying with the policy in place. I understand that we are all suffering from the COVID-19 fatigue, but we must remain vigilant. It's up to each of us to keep our families and our friends safe. Please continue to follow the health guidelines. This includes wearing a mask, hand sanitizing, and maintaining the appropriate physical distancing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. That brings us to a close of the statements and by ministers this morning. We now move on. The next item is the reports of committees. There are none. The question period. There are no written questions this morning, and I don't see any indication from members for questions related to the statements given this morning. So I'm assuming there's no questions this morning as well. So we'll move on. The next item on the order paper this morning is the congratulatory and obituary speeches. Does any member wish to make a contribution at this time? I hear